her chest, feeling the familiar weight of 2 years' worth of observations. The morning mist clung to the ancient oaks of the Cascade National Research Zone, where she had become as much a fixture as the moss-covered boulders that dotted the forest floor. Her camouflaged observation blind, positioned 70 meters from the den site, had become her second home, a place where silence was her greatest tool and patience her most valuable skill. The Kodiak bear family she monitored had grown accustomed to a presence through sheer consistency. Every dawn at 5:47 a.m., she would settle into her position. Every evening at 7:23 p.m., she would pack her equipment and retreat to the research station. No sudden movements, no flash photography, no attempts at interaction. Just quiet documentation of one of North America's most formidable predator families. Across the clearing, the massive sow known as Designation Alpha 7 emerged from the den, her golden brown fur catching the early sunlight. Elena's breath caught as it always did when witnessing the raw power of the 800-pound matriarch. Behind her, 3 cubs tumbled into view, adolescents now, each weighing nearly 200 pounds but still displaying the playful curiosity that had enchanted Elena since their birth. Through her high-powered binoculars, Elena watched the youngest cub, the one she privately called Patches due to the distinctive white marking on his chest, investigate a fallen log with typical bear persistence. His siblings, Russet and Shadow, engaged in their morning wrestling match, their mock battles preparing them for the territorial disputes they would face as adults. Elena meticulously recorded each behavior, noting the time, weather conditions, and contextual factors that might influence their activities. Her research focused on maternal teaching behaviors in apex predators, specifically how adult bears transmitted survival skills to their offspring. The data she collected would contribute to conservation efforts across the continent, but for Elena, the work had become deeply personal. She remembered her first encounter with Alpha 7 18 months ago. The massive bear had detected her scent immediately, rising on her hind legs to survey the forest with predatory intensity. Elena had remained motionless for 4 hours, her heart hammering against her ribs as the bear occasionally glanced toward her blind. That day, she had learned the meaning of true respect for wild creatures. Dr. Marcus Chen, her research partner, often questioned her methods. You could gather the same data with trail cameras and remote sensors, he would argue during their weekly video conferences. Why risk direct observation when technology can provide safer alternatives? Elena never found adequate words to explain the profound connection she felt to this bear family. Scientific objectivity demanded emotional distance, but she had discovered something beyond mere data collection in her daily vigils. She had become a guardian of sorts, a silent witness to the intimate moments of wild creatures living their lives according to ancient rhythms. The forest around her teemed with life. Stellus jays called warnings from the canopy, their harsh cries alerting other creatures to potential dangers. Douglas squirrels chattered their territorial disputes, while the distant howl of wolves reminded all inhabitants of the complex predator-prey relationships that govern this ecosystem. Elena adjusted her position slightly, her joints protesting after years of maintaining uncomfortable poses for extended periods. At 43, she sometimes wondered if her body could endure many more seasons of this demanding fieldwork. But watching Patches successfully extract grubs from the rotting log, his technique improving daily under his mother's patient guidance, Elena knew she could never abandon this family. The morning routine continued predictably. Alpha 7 would lead her cubs to the stream for fishing practice, then return to the meadow for foraging instruction. Elena would document each lesson, each maternal correction, each small victory in the cubs' education. These moments of pure wildness, untainted by human interference, had become sacred to her, a reminder of the world that existed beyond civilization's reach. Alpha 7 moved through the forest with the fluid grace that only apex predators possessed, her massive frame navigating the undergrowth with surprising silence. Elena marveled at how such a large creature could move so quietly, each step placed with deliberate precision. The bear's amber eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, processing threats and opportunities with the wisdom earned through 8 years of wilderness survival. The cubs followed in loose formation, their movements less refined but increasingly coordinated. Elena observed how Alpha 7 used subtle body language to communicate with her offspring, a slight turn of her head to indicate direction, a soft chuff to call attention, a gentle nudge to correct behavior. These interactions formed the foundation of Elena's research, documenting the complex communication systems that enabled bear families to thrive in challenging environments. At the stream's edge, Alpha 7 demonstrated fishing techniques with methodical patience. She waded into the shallow water, her powerful muscles tensing as she waited for salmon to approach. When a fish swam within range, her massive paw swept through the water with lightning speed, stunning the salmon before securing it in her jaws. The cubs watched intently, their dark eyes absorbing every detail of their mother's technique. Patches attempted to replicate his mother's actions, splashing enthusiastically into the stream. His coordination remained clumsy, and his first several attempts resulted in nothing but disturbed water and frustrated grunts. Elena smiled behind her binoculars, remembering similar scenes from previous seasons. Learning required failure, even. For apex predators, Russet, the most aggressive of the three cubs, pushed past his sibling to try his own fishing attempt. His competitive nature often led to successful catches, but also to conflicts with Patches and Shadow. Elena noted how Alpha 7 intervened when tensions escalated, using physical presence rather than aggression to restore order. The matriarch's discipline was firm but never harmful, teaching her cubs appropriate social boundaries. Shadow, the most cautious cub, preferred to observe before attempting new skills. Elena had identified this pattern early in her observations, recognizing the cub's methodical approach to learning. When Shadow finally entered the stream, her movements were more controlled than her siblings, resulting in a successful catch. On her third attempt, Alpha 7 acknowledged this achievement with a gentle nose touch, a gesture Elena had learned signified approval. The afternoon brought foraging lessons in the high meadow. Alpha 7 used her incredible sense of smell to locate buried caches of nuts and roots, demonstrating digging techniques that would sustain her cubs through winter months. Elena documented the variety of foods the bears consumed, noting seasonal preferences and nutritional strategies that enabled their survival. A distant gunshot echoed through the valley, causing Alpha 7 to freeze immediately. Her cubs instinctively moved closer to their mother, their playful demeanor replaced by alert caution. Elena felt her own pulse quicken, knowing that hunting season brought increased dangers to the bear family. She watched as Alpha 7 guided her cubs toward denser forest cover, their movements now purposeful and swift. The sound of human voices carried on the wind, causing Alpha 7 to alter course toward the rocky outcropping that served as an alternative dense site. Elena recognized the wisdom in this decision. The bears had multiple safe locations throughout their territory, enabling them to avoid human contact when necessary. She made detailed notes about their route selection and defensive strategies. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the research station's wildlife veterinarian, had warned Elena about the increasing human encroachment in the area. Tourism pressure is growing, Sarah had explained during their last meeting. We are seeing more unauthorized camping, more hikers leaving marked trails. The bears are adapting, but stress indicators are increasing. Elena had observed these changes herself. Alpha 7's behavior had become more vigilant over recent months, her attention divided between teaching her cubs and monitoring for human threats. The bear's protective instincts had intensified, sometimes limiting foraging opportunities when human activity peaked during weekend periods. As evening approached, Alpha 7 led her family back toward their primary den site. The cubs moved with less energy now, their day of learning and exploration taking its toll. Elena prepared to conclude her observation session, but noticed Alpha 7 pause at the forest edge, her massive head turning toward Elena's blind. For several moments, the two females regarded each other across the clearing. Elena held her breath, uncertain whether the bear had finally decided to investigate the human presence that had shadowed her family for so long. But Alpha 7 simply chuffed softly to her cubs and disappeared into the forest, leaving Elena with the profound sense that some form of acknowledgement had just passed between them. The relationship between Elena and the bear family had evolved through microscopic increments, each day building upon the previous day's cautious acceptance. Elena understood that trust with wild creatures could never be forced or accelerated. It emerged naturally from consistent, non-threatening presence over extended periods. Her disciplined approach had created what she termed parallel existence, where human and bear activities coexisted without interference. This morning brought unusual behavior from the cubs. Instead of following Alpha 7 immediately from the den, they lingered at the forest edge, occasionally glancing toward Elena's observation position. Patches, the most curious of the three, took several steps in her direction before his mother's warning chuff called him back. Elena remained motionless, understanding that any acknowledgement of this attention might disrupt the delicate balance they had achieved. Dr. James Whitfield, the research station director, had visited Elena's site the previous week, expressing concerns about her prolonged proximity to the bear family. The protocols exist for good reasons, he had reminded her. Previous researchers who developed emotional attachments to their subjects often compromised both their safety and their scientific objectivity. Elena respected Dr. Whitfield's experience, but she had observed changes in the bear's behavior that suggested a more complex relationship than simple habituation. Alpha 7 no longer displayed stress indicators when detecting Elena's scent. The cubs showed curiosity rather than fear when her equipment accidentally made noise. These developments indicated a level of acceptance that transcended mere tolerance. The cubs' play behavior had become more elaborate in recent weeks, as if they were performing for an audience. Patches would engage in extended wrestling matches with fallen branches, his antics becoming increasingly theatrical. Russet had developed a habit of investigating objects near Elena's position, though never approaching directly. Shadow continued her cautious observations, but now included Elena's blind in her visual surveys of the territory. Alpha 7's maternal behavior had also evolved. The massive bear had begun using Elena's presence as a reference point for territory boundaries, occasionally leading her cubs along routes that passed closer to the observation blind. Elena interpreted this as a sign that the bear had incorporated her into the landscape as a predictable, non-threatening element. The forest ecosystem had likewise adapted to Elena's extended presence. Bird species had resumed normal activity. Patterns around her blind, no longer treating her as a disturbance. Small mammals used her equipment as convenient landmarks, and she had even observed a family of river otters playing near her position while the bears foraged nearby. Dr. Lisa Thompson, a behavioral ecologist from the university, had reviewed Elena's research notes and expressed fascination with the documented behavioral changes. "You're observing something unprecedented," she had written in her evaluation. The gradual acceptance of human presence by apex predators, without feeding or direct interaction, challenges our understanding of wildlife habituation processes. Elena's daily routine had become a meditation of sorts. The hours of silent observation required intense focus and patience, qualities that had transformed her understanding of both the natural world and her own psychological patterns. She had learned to distinguish between dozens of forest sounds, to predict weather changes from subtle environmental cues, and to recognize the emotional states of individual bears through minute behavioral variations. The trust she had earned extended beyond the immediate bear family. Other wildlife had begun treating her as a neutral presence in their environment. Deer grazed openly near her position, wolves passed through the area without displaying territorial aggression toward her scent, and even the typically reclusive mountain lions had been photographed by her trail cameras operating near her observation sites. This acceptance had required sacrifices. Elena had maintained her vigil through severe weather conditions, enduring temperatures that dropped below freezing and storms that made observation impossible. She had missed holidays, social gatherings, and professional conferences to maintain her consistency with the bear family. Her personal relationships had suffered as her dedication to the research consumed increasing amounts of her time and emotional energy, but the rewards justified these sacrifices. Elena had documented maternal teaching behaviors that had never been recorded in scientific literature. She had observed problem-solving strategies, social hierarchies, and communication patterns that expanded understanding of bear intelligence and social complexity. Her work was contributing to conservation strategies that would protect bear populations throughout North America. As the afternoon sun slanted through the forest canopy, Elena watched Alpha 7 guide her cubs through their daily foraging routine. The bears moved with relaxed confidence, their behavior suggesting that they had fully integrated Elena's presence into their concept of normal environmental conditions. This achievement represented the culmination of 2 years of disciplined observation and patient relationship building. The trust they had developed was fragile and precious, built upon thousands of hours of mutual respect and careful boundaries. Elena understood that this trust could be shattered by a single moment of carelessness or inappropriate behavior. She guarded it carefully, knowing that such relationships between humans and apex predators were extraordinary and irreplaceable. The Earth trembled with a violence that Elena had never experienced in these mountains. The seismic event lasted only 43 seconds, but its effects would forever alter the landscape she had studied so meticulously. Ancient trees swayed impossibly, their massive trunks creaking with sounds like breaking bones. Rock formations that had stood for millennia shifted and cracked, sending cascades of stone tumbling into the valley below. Elena's observation blind shook violently, her carefully organized equipment scattering across the wooden platform. She gripped the support posts, her knuckles white with strain as the forest around her transformed into chaos. Through the dust and falling debris, she heard sounds that chilled her blood, the distressed calls of animals in panic, the splintering of wood, and somewhere in the distance, the high-pitched cries of cubs in terror. When the trembling finally ceased, an unnatural silence settled over the forest. Elena's ears rang from the seismic violence, but gradually she began to distinguish individual sounds emerging from the aftermath. Birds called frantically from the canopy, their territorial songs replaced by alarm calls. Small mammals crashed through the undergrowth, fleeing toward areas of greater stability. And cutting through all other sounds, the desperate vocalizations of young bears in distress. Elena grabbed her binoculars with trembling hands, scanning the forest for Alpha 7 and her cubs. The familiar landscape had been dramatically altered, fallen trees blocked previously clear pathways, and the rocky outcropping near the den site had partially collapsed. Through the settling dust, she spotted movement near what had been a stable geological formation. The site that met her eyes violated every principle of non-interference that had guided her research. Two of the cubs, Patches and Shadow, had fallen into a newly formed crevice where the earth had split during the earthquake. The fissure was narrow but deep, its walls too steep and smooth for the young bears to climb. Above them, Russet paced frantically, his distress calls echoing off the stone walls. Elena's trained eye immediately assessed the situation. The cubs were alive but trapped, their movements becoming increasingly frantic as they realized their predicament. The crevice was approximately 12 feet deep, with walls that offered no natural handholds for climbing. Without immediate intervention, hypothermia and exhaustion would claim the cubs within hours. Alpha 7 was nowhere to be seen. Elena remembered that the matriarch had left that morning to fish at the distant lake, a journey that typically kept her away for several hours. The earthquake might have triggered landslides or other obstacles that could delay her return. By the time the mother bear discovered her cub's predicament, it might be too late. Elena's hands shook as she reached for her satellite phone, but the device displayed no signal. The seismic event had likely damaged the communication towers that served this remote area. Her radio equipment had been destroyed during the earthquake, leaving her completely isolated from the research station and any potential rescue resources. The ethical protocols that governed her research were absolute and unambiguous. Under no circumstances should field researchers interact directly with their study subjects. Intervention could alter natural behavioral patterns, create dangerous dependencies, and potentially result in aggressive responses from protective parents. Elena had signed agreements acknowledging these restrictions and accepting full responsibility for maintaining appropriate boundaries, but the cubs' cries grew increasingly desperate, their voices breaking with exhaustion and fear. Patches, the smallest and most vulnerable, had stopped moving actively, conserving energy in a manner that suggested survival instincts were overriding panic. Shadow continued attempting to climb the smooth walls, her claws scraping futilely against the stone surface. Elena calculated the possibilities. If she maintained her non-interference stance, the cubs would likely die before Alpha 7's return. If she attempted a rescue, she would violate every professional standard that governed wildlife research. The mother bear might attack her as a threat to her remaining offspring. The research project could be terminated, and her career might be destroyed. The decision crystallized in a moment of absolute clarity. Elena packed her emergency rope and climbing gear with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic despite the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. She had spent 2 years earning the trust of this bear family, documenting their daily lives and developing a profound respect for their intelligence and social bonds. She would not abandon them now. Elena moved through the transformed forest with urgent purpose, navigating fallen trees and unstable terrain. With the knowledge gained through months of careful observation, every step carried her further from the safe boundaries of scientific protocol and deeper into uncharted territory where human compassion intersected with wildness in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. The cubs' cries guided her through the debris-strewn landscape, their voices growing stronger as she approached the crevice. Elena understood that she was about to cross a threshold that could never be uncrossed, entering a space where the careful distance between observer and subject would collapse into direct, irrevocable contact. Elena approached the crevice with the methodical precision that had characterized her research, but now her scientific training served a different purpose. She assessed the rock formation, the depth of the fissure, and the condition of the trapped cubs with the clinical detachment necessary for successful rescue operations. Patches lay motionless at the bottom of the crevice, his breathing shallow but regular. Shadow continued her attempts to escape, but her movements had become sluggish with exhaustion. Russet's reaction to Elena's approach defied her expectations. Instead of fleeing or displaying aggressive behavior, the remaining cub watched her with intense curiosity. His distress calls had diminished to soft whimpers, as if recognizing that help had arrived from an unexpected source. Elena interpreted this response as evidence of the trust that had developed through their extended coexistence. The rescue operation required technical skills Elena had learned during her wilderness training, but never expected to use in her research context. She secured her climbing rope to a stable tree trunk, testing the anchor point with her full weight before committing to the descent. The crevice walls were smooth and offered minimal handholds, but Elena's experience with technical climbing enabled her to rappel safely into the narrow space. The trapped cub's reaction to her presence within the crevice was extraordinary. Rather than panicking at the close proximity of a human, both bears remained calm, their behavior suggesting recognition of Elena as a familiar presence in their environment. Patches, despite his weakened condition, allowed Elena to secure a makeshift harness around his torso using emergency webbing from her pack. The ascent proved more challenging than the descent. Elena's muscles strained against the combined weight of her own body and the young bear, her hands bleeding from contact with the rough rope fibers. Patches remained remarkably still during the vertical journey, his cooperation essential for the success of the rescue operation. When they reached the surface, Elena gently released the cub, who immediately moved toward his brother with evident relief. Shadow's rescue required similar technical precision, but the slightly larger cub presented additional challenges. Elena's strength was depleting rapidly, and she understood that this second ascent would test the limits of her physical capabilities. The bear's cooperation remained consistent with Patch's behavior, suggesting that both cubs had developed sufficient trust in Elena to accept her assistance during this crisis. As Elena completed the second rescue, her entire body trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline. The three cubs huddled together at the edge of the crevice, their reunion marked by gentle touching and soft vocalizations. Elena retreated to a respectful distance, uncertain how to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the forest announced Alpha 7's return. Elena's blood pressure spiked as she considered the possible consequences of her intervention. The massive bear emerged from the tree line at full speed, her powerful muscles propelling her 800-pound frame with incredible velocity. Her eyes immediately located her cubs, and Elena prepared for the worst possible scenario. Alpha 7's initial response was pure maternal instinct. She positioned herself between Elena and her cubs, rising to her full height in a display of intimidating power. Elena remained motionless, avoiding direct eye contact while keeping the bear family in her peripheral vision. The next few moments would determine whether her years of careful relationship building would protect her from the mother bear's protective fury, but Alpha 7's behavior defied every prediction Elena might have made. After thoroughly examining each of her cubs, the massive bear turned her attention to Elena with an expression that seemed to convey recognition rather than aggression. The bear approached slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled, stopping just beyond Elena's reach. What happened next challenged Elena's understanding of interspecies communication. Alpha 7 extended her massive head toward Elena, her nose nearly touching the human's shoulder. The gesture lasted only seconds, but its meaning was unmistakable: acknowledgement, gratitude, and a redefinition of the relationship between them. Elena remained perfectly still as the bear family departed, the cubs following their mother toward alternative shelter in the transformed landscape. Only when they had disappeared completely did Elena allow herself to comprehend the full impact of the day's events. She had violated every professional protocol, risked her career and potentially her life, and emerged with something unprecedented. In wildlife research, the relationship between Elena and the bear family had transcended the boundaries of scientific observation. Through her intervention during their crisis, she had become something more than a passive observer. She had become a recognized member of their extended social network. The trust that had developed slowly over 2 years had been tested and strengthened through direct action. Elena's research would continue, but under entirely different circumstances. The bears no longer treated her as a neutral presence in their environment, they now recognized her as an active participant in their survival and well-being. This development would require new protocols, new understanding, and new ways of documenting the complex relationships that could develop between humans and apex predators. As evening approached, Elena made her way back to the research station. Her body aching from the physical demands of the rescue, but her spirit transformed by the experience. She had witnessed something remarkable, the moment when careful observation became direct care, when scientific distance collapsed into personal connection, and when the boundaries between human and wild became beautifully, irrevocably blurred. The quiet vigil that had defined her relationship with the bear family had ended, but in its place, a sacred bond had been forged through shared crisis and mutual trust. Elena understood that her research would never be the same, but she also knew that she had participated in something far more meaningful than data collection. She had become part of the complex web of relationships that sustain life in the wilderness.